This book is called The Federalist Papers. It was written by three of the prominent founding fathers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, to explain to the newly united states why it needed a federal constitution. Now, there's currently a law school professor who requires all of his law students to read the Federalist Papers. After all, since they were written by the founding fathers to explain the purpose of the Constitution, they are perhaps the best source from which to understand the Constitution's intent. Now, his students, enrolled in graduate-level legal studies, regularly return to him complaining that this is the most difficult book they've ever had to read. He nods his head. I understand that. This book was not written for someone at your level. This book was written for the common, average, upstate New York farmer of 1787. Perhaps someday you'll attain the educational level of those New York farmers. What a remarkable educational system we must have had then, and what a remarkable education our founding fathers must have received. After all, they established the form of government that's now lasted over 2 centuries securely. In a moment, we'll look at the educational system that produced these great men and at the steps that our founding fathers themselves took to ensure that America would always continue to have a successful educational system.
You do well to wish to learn our arts and way of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ.
I have always said, and always will say, that the studious perusal of the sacred volume will make us better citizens.
What kind of an educational system produced such remarkable men? Well, let's look at some of the schools they attended. Now, colleges and universities then, just like they do now, gave out a list of prospective requirements for students who wanted to attend that school, and so the students had to fulfill the requirements to attend that school. Let's look at a school like Harvard. Harvard was established first in 1636. It's the longest ongoing college in America, and Harvard was attended by founding fathers like John Adams and John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Look at the requirements to attend Harvard. Harvard very clearly stated that every student shall be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only solid foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. What a remarkable requirement to go to Harvard. To go to Harvard, you had to understand your primary purpose for being there was to know God and Jesus Christ, and Harvard had other requirements as well. Notice this one. They said that everyone shall so exercise himself in reading the Scriptures twice a day that he shall be ready to give such an account of his proficiency therein. You had to know the Scriptures to go to Harvard. Well, Yale was another school attended by many of the founding fathers. As a matter of fact, you take people like William Johnson, William Livingston, who were both signers of the Constitution, people like Noah Webster, they all went to Yale. Now, Yale had been founded in 1701, but look at the requirements to go to Yale. Look at the requirements our founding fathers had to fulfill to go to Yale. Now, Yale explained that it was a college for the liberal and religious education of suitable youth. Look at the requirements for Yale. They said, seeing that God is the giver of all wisdom, every scholar, besides his private or his secret prayer, now they expect you to have a prayer life at Yale, but in addition to your private or secret prayer, you'll be present morning and evening at public prayer. To go to Yale, you had to have a prayer life, private prayer as well as public prayer. Another major university would be Princeton. We had 87 of the founding fathers come out of Princeton University. Now, Princeton was established in 1746, which was just shortly before many of the founders started attending school. President James Madison is an alumnus of Princeton. You have Benjamin Rush, who also comes from Princeton. Look at the founding statement for Princeton University. It says, "Cursed is all learning that's contrary to the cross of Christ." What a remarkable statement for a university to be founded on. Well, Christianity was the core of education all the way through the time of the founding fathers. It was also the core of education from the founding of America till well after the founding fathers. As a matter of fact, the first law on public education ever passed in America was passed in 1642 in Connecticut and Massachusetts. It's a remarkable law. This book contains the laws of those early years of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and it tells you exactly why they passed the law on education. And you have to understand that those settlers who had come to America at that point were very concerned about civil atrocities that had happened in Europe. And those civil atrocities in Europe many times happened under the banner of Christianity. For example, the Inquisition, the Crusades. Well, these settlers that had come to America that was still fresh in their memory, and they did not want any such civil atrocity to happen under the banner of Christ in America. But they felt like they knew exactly the reason that such atrocities had occurred. In their minds it was clear that because the average person did not have access to the Word of God, that those atrocities had occurred. They felt like if the common person could have read the Word of God, known what the Word of God had said, that they never would have allowed the civil government to do what they did in the name of Christ. So to preclude any type of a repetition in America, those settlers passed this law. The title of that law was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And the Old Deluder Satan Act explained exactly why we were emphasizing education in America. It says, it being the one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from a knowledge of the Scriptures as he has in former times, and that's the purpose of the law, because Satan's primary intent is to keep people out of the Scriptures. We're not going to allow that to happen here in America. They went on to explain that when you get 50 families into a colony, you get a teacher. When you get 100 families into a colony, you build them a grammar school so that the youth can learn and be fitted for the university. Now that was the educational law in America, but that went for decades, literally centuries. This was a book written in 1809 by Edward Kendall. Now Edward Kendall was a man from Great Britain who had come to America to see what made America so special. And that was not unusual. In the early days of America, many people came here to see what made America such a special nation. Edward Kendall traveled the United States in 1807, 1808. He recorded meticulous journals of his records. He went back to Great Britain in 1809, and he published those records in a 3-volume set. Now, as he went from state to state, he would look at specific things. He would look, for example, at politics in this state, or agriculture here, or public education here. And when he was in Connecticut, he looked at education, and he recorded the educational law that was on the books in Connecticut at that time. It says, this court observing that notwithstanding our former orders made for the education of children and servants, there are still many persons unable to read the English tongue and thereby incapable to read the holy word of God or the good laws of this colony. You see, they were concerned about illiteracy, but not perhaps for the reasons we're concerned today. The reason for concern then was if you can't read, you can't read the Word of God or the laws of the colony, which means that we in this state might pass a law that would contradict the Word of God, and you the people would never stop us because you can't read and you don't know the Word of God, and we would all be in trouble because we would violate the Scriptures. Now that was the law after the Founding Fathers. That was the type of educational system we had all the way through from the beginning to well after the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers themselves took steps to ensure that Christian education would remain the center of America. Prior to the adoption of the Federal Constitution, the nation had governed itself under the Articles of Confederation. That had been our form of government through the American Revolution. And under the Articles of Confederation, the Founding Fathers had passed what was called the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was the provision whereby territories could become states in the United States. Well, when the convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, they actually met to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they came out with a new Constitution. And so under the new constitutional form of government, the Founding Fathers wanted to continue with the Northwest Ordinance as the provision for statehood in the United States. So they repassed the Northwest Ordinance under the new constitutional form of government. On July the 17th, 1789, the House of Representatives passed it. On August the 4th, the Senate passed it, and on August the 7th, George Washington signed it into law. And the Northwest Ordinance gave all the procedures whereby a territory could apply for statehood in these newly United States. Well, what was significant in that Northwest Ordinance was Article 3, whereby the Founding Fathers provided for education in those territories. And this was a requirement to come into the United States, that you had to have your educational system in a certain way. Article 3 required that if your schools did not teach religion and morality as well as knowledge, you were not welcome to become a state in the United States. That was part of the Northwest Ordinance. The Founding Fathers passed that, and what's significant is they passed the Northwest Ordinance right in the midst of the time that they were working on the First Amendment. The First Amendment went from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the Northwest Ordinance was right in the middle of the First Amendment, which the court now tells us means separation of church and state. Is it likely that the Founding Fathers required something by law that they thought violated the First Amendment? Certainly not. And the Founding Fathers required that our schools teach religion and morality as well as knowledge to even become a state in the United States. And that was evidenced in the states that came into the United States under the Northwest Ordinance. For example, when a state would apply for admission into the United States, Congress would grant them an enabling act telling them that they could assemble and they could form a state constitution as long as it was not repugnant to the principles of the Northwest Ordinance. For example, with Ohio, April the 30th of 1802, Congress gave the Enabling Act saying, Ohio, you can meet November the 1st, 1802, and you can form your state constitution provided that it is not repugnant to the principles of the Northwest Ordinance. So, Ohio did form a state constitution. What's included in their state constitution reflects what the Founding Fathers had required for admission to the United States. In the Ohio State Constitution, it clearly says that religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of instruction shall forever be encouraged by legislative provision. Now that was a requirement to come into the United States, and that's why it was in the state constitution, was the Founding Fathers said, you're not welcome in these United States if your schools do not teach religion and morality. The same was true, for example, when Mississippi was brought in 1817. Their state constitution says that religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government, the preservation of liberty, and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged in this state. And it continued on for decade after decade after for example, even when Nebraska was brought in 1875, their state constitution requires the same provision. It says very clearly that religion, morality, and knowledge, however, being essential to good government, it shall be the duty of the legislature to pass suitable laws to encourage schools and the means of instruction. And again, the reason that appeared in all of these state constitutions, and there are many other states other than those we've just shown, is because the Founding Fathers required that by federal law to become a state in the United States. And that was very evident in our educational system for years afterwards. This is a book done by teachers' unions in 1892. Educational teachers' unions. They did this book on the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus Day in America. It was almost like a World's Fair, a large celebration, and the teachers' unions got together and said, we want to leave a legacy of what education has been like in America. And so in the book, they went through and they talked about education in America, where it had started, where it had been birthed, and they showed exactly what we've already looked at, that, as they said, that education was nurtured in the laps of the church. But they pointed out that as the nation grew and we had more and more inhabitants in the nation, that the church voluntarily relinquished elementary education to the state. The church said, state, you take elementary education, we'll keep the higher universities, we'll keep higher education, but you can go ahead and start taking elementary education. Now listen to the comment of the teachers' unions on that decision. They said, whether this was wise or not is not our purpose to discuss, further than to remark that if the study of the Bible is to be excluded from all state schools, if the inculcation of the principles of Christianity is to have no place in the daily program, if the worship of God is to form no part of the general exercises of these public elementary schools, then the good of the state would be better served by restoring all schools to church control. That's a strong statement. The teachers' unions in 1892 said, if we ever get to where we don't teach the Bible in schools, we don't inculcate the principles of Christianity, and we don't have the daily worship of God, let's give all the schools back to the church because we'd all be better off if the church would keep the schools. Now this was not an aberration in American education. 106 of the first 108 colleges formed in America were formed on Christianity. 123 out of the first 126 were formed on Christianity. As a matter of fact, at the time of the Civil War, there were hardly half a dozen universities that did not have Christianity as the base of that university. And in 1900, it was very rare to find a president of a university who was not a clergyman. Christianity was the basis of education for all of the years of America. Well, our Founding Fathers recognized that education was vital to the success of a nation. They knew that you had to transmit to future generations those principles that would make America successful on into the future. And so the Founding Fathers became very concerned with education, and many of them became directly involved in education to make sure that we would transmit into future generations those principles on which America had been formed and birthed and nurtured and developed. For example, consider someone like John Witherspoon. Now, John Witherspoon was a member of Congress. He's a patriot. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But John Witherspoon was also an educator. He was the president of Princeton University. You remember the university which had declared, "Cursed is all learning that's contrary to the cross of Christ"? Well, John Witherspoon trained at least 87 of the nation's founding fathers. Now, at the time that he was training them in school, he didn't know that they were going to be founding fathers. They were simply attending college there, and he was the president of the college, and he trained these men in their classes. But we can now look back and count and see whom he trained in class. It is a distinguished list. John Witherspoon personally trained one president, one vice president, 3 Supreme Court justices, 10 cabinet members, 12 governors, 21 senators, and 39 congressmen, all under the philosophy that says cursed is all learning which is contrary to the cross of Christ. And that doesn't even count the people that he trained for state office and for local office and for municipal office. He had a great impact as an educator. And he also did a lot of writing as an educator. Most of the Founding Fathers were prolific writers. John Witherspoon taught his students what it meant to be a patriot in America. As a matter of fact, reading from some of his works, listen to his description of how you can distinguish an American patriot. He says, "What follows from this? That he is the best friend to American liberty, who is the most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down on profanity and immorality of every kind." He continues, he says, "Whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I do not hesitate, or I scruple not, to call him an enemy to his country." Now, what a strong statement by one of the Founding Fathers themselves. Said, if you're a friend to America, you'll promote religion. You'll bear down on profanity. You'll bear down on immorality, because the Founding Fathers knew that the government and the nation was always a reflection of the individuals in that nation. If the individuals were profane and immoral, the government would be profane and immoral. He said, if you're a friend to America, you'll bear down on that. You'll work on personal virtue. You'll emphasize religion and morality. He further went on to explain that if you oppose God, you oppose America, because we stand for the same thing. He says, if you're an enemy of God, you're an enemy of America. Now, that's a Founding Father who taught that to students, and of course that was the philosophy of the Founding Fathers. Another significant Founding Father would be Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush was a patriot. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was probably the most distinguished physician of his time. He was surgeon and founder of the Pennsylvania Hospital. And it was also Benjamin Rush who was very instrumental in effecting a reconciliation between John Adams and between Thomas Jefferson in their latter years. They'd been political opponents all their lives. And he managed to bring them back together in friendship in their latter years. Well, Benjamin Rush, like the other Founding Fathers, did a lot of extensive writing. One of the articles that he wrote was on what he called a defense of the use of the Bible in schools. Now, that article explained why the Bible was to continue to be the primary textbook in American schools. Let me read to you some of the excerpts out of his writings. Now, he starts his writings by explaining his premise that he will develop in this text. He says, "It's now been several months since I promised to give you reasons for preferring the Bible as a school book to all other compositions." He says, "Now, before I state my arguments, I shall assume the 5 following propositions." Now, here this Founding Father is laying the foundation for why we should have the Bible in schools. He says, number 1, that Christianity is the only true and perfect religion, and that in proportion as mankind adopts its principles and obeys its precepts, they will be wise and happy. Number 2, that a better knowledge of this religion is to be acquired by reading the Bible than in any other way. Number 3, that the Bible contains more knowledge necessary to man in his present state than any other book in the world. Number 4, that knowledge is most durable and religious instruction most useful when imparted in early life. And number 5, that the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. Now, that's his beginning proposition, and he goes through about 15 different arguments on why the Bible has to remain the primary textbook of schools. And this, again, is a Founding Father. In the latter part of this section, he closes out with what he considers to be a lament on what happens if we get away from using the Bible as the primary textbook in schools. And recall, at this point in time, the Founding Fathers did not consider us a democracy. They considered us a republic. As a matter of fact, several of them made significant statements that said, we are not a democracy, we're not to become a democracy, we're a republic. We pledge allegiance to a republic when we pledge to the flag of the United States. Now, realizing that republic was their primary word, listen to how he closes his section on the Bible in schools. He says, "In contemplating the political institutions of the United States, I lament that we waste so much time and money in punishing crimes and take so little pains to prevent them. We profess to be Republicans, and yet we neglect the only means of establishing and perpetuating our Republican forms of government, that is, the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by the means of the Bible. For this divine book, above all others, favors that equality among mankind, that respect for just laws, and those sober and frugal virtues which constitute the soul of republicanism." For him, it was very clear that if we didn't keep the Bible in schools, we would be spending a lot of time punishing crimes, because the Bible is the only source that could prevent crimes, because the Bible and religion is the only means by which you can deal with the heart, and the heart is actually the source of all crime. Well, another significant Founding Father is Gouverneur Morris. Now, Governor Morse is not a name that most of us recognize, and it's not a face that most of us recognize, but we certainly recognize his work. Governor Morse was a member of the Constitutional Convention, and actually he was the most active member of the Constitutional Convention, speaking 173 times on the floor of the convention. Now, Governor Morse was head of the Committee on Style, and although many people don't know his name, they don't know his face, they do recognize what he did because he was the man who physically wrote the Constitution of the United States. He was responsible for taking the rough ideas floating around on the floor of the convention and translating them onto paper. He literally, physically wrote the Constitution. Well, having been successful in that form of government, in establishing America's form of government, he decided to be helpful to assist the French because the French had helped us during the Revolution. And so he took his experience in the Constitutional Convention and translated it into 2 books for the French. Those 2 books were called Observations on Government Applicable to the Political State of France and Notes on the Form of a Constitution for France. And in these 2 works, Governor Morse explained to France some of the things that we had utilized in our own system. He was making recommendations for them. He just said, let us save you the time. We've done the research, we've done the work. Take these ideas, implement them into your government. Now, at that point, France was coming out of their revolution. They needed to establish a government. Look at what Governor Morse, now here's the man who wrote the Constitution, look at what he said about the role of religion in education. He said, religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Therefore, education should teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man toward God. He was recommending to France what we already had in America, that France, you have to understand that morality is based on religion, and education needs to teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man toward God if you expect to have a successful constitutional form of government. Now, another founding father significant in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is Fisher Ames of Massachusetts. Fisher Ames of Massachusetts is the man who proposed the wording for the First Amendment, the amendment that the court now says means separation of church and state. Now, in the original Bill of Rights, there were 12 amendments proposed by Congress. And as they sent those 12 amendments to the states did not ratify the first 2. They only ratified the last 10. And those last 10 are now the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, our Bill of Rights. Fisher Ames is the one who gave us the wording that says Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, this man who gave us the wording for the First Amendment, which the court now uses as separation of church and state, listen to what he said about the role of the Bible in schools. Like the other founding fathers, he was very prolific in his writings. And in his writings, he dealt with school books. And one of the writings in which he dealt with school books, he noticed a trend in America that we were adding more and more and more books into our educational system. He says, it has been the custom of late years to put a number of little books into the hands of children containing fables and moral lessons. And this is very well because it is first right to raise curiosity and then to guide it. But many books for children are, however, injudiciously compiled. Now, he was concerned because these new books coming in were starting to move the Bible to the back of education. And he did not want to see that happen. So in closing this writing on school books, he says this. He says, why then, if these books for children must be retained, as they will be, should not the Bible regain the place it once held as a school book? Its morals are pure, its examples captivating and noble. The reverence for the sacred book that is thus impressed early lasts long, and probably, if not impressed in infancy, never takes firm hold of the mind. Now, that's the man who gave us the First Amendment, saying we have to make sure that we don't allow other books to push the Bible out of schools, because if we don't keep the Bible in schools, if the Bible doesn't take hold in youth, we'll probably never get it in adult years. And this was the man who gave us the wording of the First Amendment. Well, another one of the significant founding fathers was Noah Webster. We hear Noah Webster and we think, wait a minute, he's the guy with the dictionary. He's the one that gave us the dictionary. And that's right, he did give us the dictionary, but he was also a founding father. He was a soldier during the American Revolution. He spent 9 terms in the Connecticut legislature. He spent 3 terms in Massachusetts legislature and 4 terms as a judge. And like the rest of the founding fathers, he knew that we had to pass on to future generations those principles that would make us successful. And that's why Noah Webster got involved in education. He wrote his first spellers and primers in the 1780s. From that, he came up with a dictionary that he called a Compendium of Words in 1809. Then he came out with his big dictionary in 1828. He wrote history books. He wrote books on government. He wrote books on science and astronomy. He was very prolific as a writer. And in going through his textbooks, he was also very open about what he felt to be the foundational principles for students going through school, the things that they needed to know most often. Now, even in his large dictionary, and this is a copy of his large dictionary from the early years, it has in the beginning a section about Noah Webster. This particular dictionary is from 1864, and it begins by telling us who Noah Webster is, telling us something about his life. And it's remarkable to read in here about Noah Webster's life. Let me read to you right out of this dictionary. It talks about how that a revival was going on at Yale, and Noah Webster had attended Yale. And going back to Yale, he was impressed by what he saw there with the ministers. And it said he was thus led to reconsider his former views and to inquire with an earnestness which he had never felt before into the nature of personal religion and the true ground of man's acceptance with God. Under a sense of this responsibility, he took up the study of the Bible with painful solicitude. As he advanced, the objections which he had formerly entertained against the humbling doctrines of the gospel were wholly removed. He felt their truth in his own experience. He felt that salvation must be wholly of grace. He felt constrained, as he afterward told a friend, to cast himself down before God, confess his sins, implore pardon through the merits of the Redeemer, and there to make his vows of entire obedience to the commands and devotion to the service of his Maker. And then it talks about how that he then took this teaching back into his family. He had neglected teaching his family from the Bible in previous years, but now, having seen the change in his life that was made through Christianity and the Bible, he took it right back to his family. It says, while he had aimed at the faithful discharge of all of his duties as their parent and head, he had neglected one of the most important, that of family prayer. After reading the Scriptures, he led them with deep solemnity to the throne of grace, and from that time continued the practice with the liveliest interest to the period of his death. He made a public profession of religion in April 1808. And it continues to talk about his life and how that as he grew older in later years, in his 80s, he had a sickness which came upon him, which he did not think to be particularly serious. He expected to recover from it, kind of like a common cold. But it became obvious to the doctors that this was not just a common cold. This was not a natural sickness. And that surprised Noah Webster because he felt in fine health. But the doctors had fearful indications of a fatal result, and it soon became necessary to inform him that he was in imminent danger. He received the communication with surprise, but with entire composure. He expressed his entire resignation to the will of God and his unshaken trust in the atoning blood of the Redeemer. I know in whom I have believed. Such was the solemn and affecting testimony which he gave to his friend while the hand of death was upon him. I know in whom I have believed, and that he is able to keep that which I have committed to him against that day. Thus, without one doubt, one fear, he resigned his soul into the hands of his Maker and died on the 28th day of May, 1843, and the 85th year of his age. Now, can you imagine finding an account like that in the beginning of Webster dictionaries today? And yet that was the account that always accompanied the Webster dictionaries then. But Webster was also, as I pointed out, very influential in education in other ways. You see, prior to Noah Webster, there was not a right way or a wrong way to spell a word in America. However you wanted to spell a word was fine. You could go at it any way, and as long as people could tell what you were saying, that was okay. And you could read the letters from different people written across different parts of the nation and tell where they were from. You could tell just by the way they spelled their words. For example, in the South, there's a tendency to take three-letter words and make them sound like three syllables, like dog. But then in the North, there's a real tendency to only have 25 letters in the alphabet. A lot of places in the North, I'm not sure they know what the letter R is. They pak, the ka, and the yad, they don't know what an R is. Well, you would find that reflected in the letters that were written at that time. In the South, it was very common for them to have a lot of extra A's and O's and U's in their writings. And in the North, there were certain letters missing. So you could just look at a letter and tell where someone was from by the way they had spelled the words. For example, you can tell in the 1783 letter that it was written by someone from the South. Look, for example, at the words that are underlined and highlighted. Particular, denominators. You can tell just by the spelling that this was written by someone who has that same type of phonetic pronunciation, someone from the South. Oh, Webster said, no, no, no. He said, we've got to standardize spelling in the United States. And so in the 1780s, he came out with the first spellers. Now, those spellers that came out in the 1780s remained the standard of American schools for 150 years. They became known as Webster's blueback speller. But the original one in 1780, through the blueback spellers, for 150 years, up through 1930, we used Webster's as a standard for spelling in America. Now, in these spelling books, particularly this one, this is a 1908 version, you'll notice that when you open it, it's very much like books are today. There's nothing on the inside cover, there's nothing on the flyleaf, and that was standard. We're used to that. But at the time of Webster, he thought that was a waste of space. Why would you take a blank piece of paper, run it through a press, and print nothing on it? No, if you had blank paper, let's put something in there that is useful for students. And so, in Webster's version, you'll find that he filled everything. The cover, the flyleaf, everything is completely filled with printing. Now, what was it that he put in there to fill all blank space, something that would be significant and useful for the students? Well, for example, here in the back cover, you'll notice that it's all Bible verses. It says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." He took and filled the empty place with Bible verses. There was nothing more significant which the students could be trained, and that was what our founding father put into educational materials that he wrote. Now, those spellers that we used for 150 years, not only did he give you spelling words, he gave you an opportunity to practice the words in sentences and even in stories. But they weren't nonsensical sentences or useless stories. No, if you were going to practice, let's get something good out of it. And so in the back of the book, he had several stories from which the students could practice their reading, practice the use of their spelling words. Notice, for example, this story. It's called The Fable of the Boy That Stole Apples. And you'll see there in the tree, there's a young boy up in the tree with apples in his lap, and down below him is a man standing there. Listen to what we taught in schools, the type of lessons that we had for 150 years, and notice the moral lessons here. He said, "An old man found a rude boy upon one of his trees stealing apples, and he desired him to come down. But the young saucebox told him plainly he would not come down. 'Won't you?' said the old man. 'Then I will fetch you down.' So he pulled up some turf or grass and threw at him." But this only made the youngster laugh, to think that the old man should pretend to beat him down from the tree with grass only. "Well, well," said the old man, "if neither words nor grass will do, I must try what virtue there is in stones." So the old man pelted him heartily with stones, which soon made the young chap hasten down from the tree and beg the old man's pardon. The moral of the story? If good words and gentle means will not reclaim the wicked, they must be dealt with in a more severe manner. Now, that was the type of material that we had in Webster's books for 150 years, and all through his books. And he wrote history books, he wrote science books. He was very explicit in the source of the materials. This is what he said concerning education in general in the United States. He said the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. He said the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people. Such quotes were found throughout Webster's educational works. For example, the book that he wrote, The History of the United States, was not only a history text for students, but it dealt with young students on the responsibilities of their duties in government. It gave them their civic responsibilities. And all throughout this history book, also a history combination civics government book, he had numerous quotes. In the very beginning, as he tells the students what they'll be learning, he makes this statement. He said, "The brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of Republican government. And it is the sincere desire of the writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion." Well, as he got on further in the text, he had a section that was called Advice for Youth. And in Advice for Youth, he told young people what would happen if we despised and neglected the Bible, if we moved away from the Bible at the base of our government. Notice this statement that he made. He said, "The moral principles and precepts contained in the Scriptures ought to form the basis of all of our civil constitutions and laws. All of the miseries and evils which men suffer from vice, from crime, from ambition, from injustice, from oppression, from slavery and war, they all proceed from despising and neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible." What a strong statement. He said all the trouble that we get into is because we don't follow the teachings of the Bible. And then as he concluded his section on government, this was a statement that he told the students. He said, "The religion which has introduced civil liberty is the religion of Christ and his apostles. This is genuine Christianity, and to this we owe our free constitutions of government." Webster was very explicit all throughout his textbooks about the importance of Christianity to government. As a matter of fact, he looked at the world, at government, at people, at the nature of people, and realized there were only two ways to control behavior. You could control behavior internally by internal restraints. As Benjamin Rush said, we can prevent crime by teaching the principles of the Word of God. Or you have to have a government that will force you to do what's right, a very oppressive regime. This is a statement Webster made concerning that. He said, "There are only two powers which are sufficient to control men and secure the rights of individuals in a peaceable administration. These are the combined force of religion and law and the force or fear of the bayonet." And that was a principle that was understood for generations. Politicians for decades understood that same principle. Robert Winthrop was a great American statesman. He was a Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was personally trained by Daniel Webster, the great American statesman. Robert Winthrop explained the same principle this way. He said, "Men, in a word, must necessarily be controlled either by a power within them or by a power without them, either by the Word of God or by the strong arm of man, either by the Bible or by the bayonet." Now that was the principles that Webster had articulated for so many years, a founding father writing material, educational material that we used in the United States for 150 years. And it's interesting to see the way that Webster was described after his death. After his death, he had started all the spellers. His son, William Webster, carried on the tradition of keeping those spellers running. And in the beginning of the Webster spellers that came out after Webster's death, they had a little section dedicated to Noah Webster because he was one of the top educators in America. And in that section, it's interesting the epigraph that they place over the picture of Noah Webster. Notice what they say about Webster. They said, he's the man who taught millions to read, but not one to sin. What a remarkable statement for one of the founding fathers. Well, another founding father was Dr. Jedediah Morse. Dr. Jedediah Morse was very active on the political scene during the American Revolution, and he would be considered one of the top 3 educators of America at that time. Dr. Jedediah Morse is called the father of American geography. He's the man who really instituted the study of geography as a course in American schools. In 1784, he came out with his first book called Geography Made Easy. And in that book, he took students through lessons on geography, lessons on government, lessons on history. He was also a very prolific writer of textbooks. And it's amazing to see what we had in the front of his geography book. Here's a map of the United States from 1798, a remarkable likeness. In his writings, he also had much to say about the importance of Christianity to government. Notice, for example, this statement. He said, to the kindly influence of Christianity, we owe that degree of civil freedom and political and social happiness which mankind now enjoys. In proportion as the genuine effects of Christianity are diminished in the nation, in the same proportion will the people of that nation recede from the blessings of genuine freedom. I hold this to be a truth confirmed by experience, and it follows that all efforts made to destroy the foundations of our holy religion ultimately tend to the subversion also of our political freedom and happiness. Whenever the pillars of Christianity shall be overthrown, our present republican forms of government and all the blessings which flow from them must fall with them. What a remarkable warning. As we lose the influence of Christianity in the nation, we also lose the blessings that come in the nation. We lose our political and our social freedoms when we lose the effect of Christianity. Well, there were numerous founding fathers still concerned about education. For example, the cousins, John and Samuel Adams. Now, both of them were eminent statesmen and patriots. They both had distinguished political careers. Samuel Adams is called the father of the American Revolution. Samuel Adams gave over 20 years of his life in the cause of American liberty. He was behind everything from the Sons of Liberty to the Committees of Correspondence, even the Boston Tea Party. And Samuel Adams had a long political career after the Revolution. He was very active in Massachusetts politics. He helped write that state's constitution. He helped ratify the federal constitution of Massachusetts. He became lieutenant governor under John Hancock and then finally became the state's governor after Hancock left office. Well, his cousin, John Adams, had an equally distinguished career. John Adams was one who personally recommended George Washington to Congress as Commander-in-Chief. He's also the one who went to Thomas Jefferson and asked him to write the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was one of the 3 men who negotiated the final peace treaty with Great Britain. John Adams was the first Vice President of the United States under George Washington. He became the 2nd President of the United States. They both had a lot of stake in seeing America continue on the foundation which they had built. Well, there was a series of letters that went back and forth between these 2 cousins as political officials, as public officials, as governmental officials in 1790. And those letters were so significant that in 1802, they were reprinted in the form of a little booklet. And that booklet is now at Harvard in the Political Tract Library. The name of that booklet was an exceptionally long title. It was called 4 Letters, being an interesting correspondence between those eminently distinguished characters, John Adams, late President of the United States, and Samuel Adams, late Governor of Massachusetts, on the important subject of government. And in those letters, they wrote back and forth to each other, recommending and explaining what they thought we needed to do to keep America on a strong foundation. Now, understand, these 2 did not have the same political views. They were diametrically opposed. John Adams thought we needed a strong central government. Samuel Adams thought we needed a small central federal government, but we needed the people to have a lot of power and the states to have a lot of power. So politically, they didn't agree on a whole lot. Now, as Samuel Adams was writing to John Adams, he made this recommendation on what we should do to keep America on a firm foundation. He said, what is to be done? Let divines and philosophers, let statesmen and patriots, let's unite their endeavors to renovate the age by impressing the minds of men with the importance of educating their little boys and girls, of inculcating in the minds of youth the fear and love of the deity and universal philanthropy, and in subordination to these great principles, the love of their country, of instructing them in the art of self-government, without which they can never act a wise part in the government of societies, great or small, in short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system. Now, they didn't agree on a whole lot, but John Adams wrote back to Samuel Adams in the next letter and said, "On this, you and I agree." They both agreed that if we wanted to keep the foundation, we were going to have to teach our little boys and girls the exalted virtues of the Christian system if we ever expected to be a strong country. Well, George Washington was another that had strong views on education. There was an incident that happened with George Washington in 1779 during the American Revolution which revealed his strong commitment to Christian education. Now, George Washington had strong respect among the Indians. That had started decades before in the middle of the French and Indian War. In 1754 and 1755, some miraculous incidents happened with God's direct intervention keeping Washington from being killed by the Indians. And the Indians had always respected Washington for that. And because of that, because of their great respect and admiration for him, in 1779, when Washington was encamped on the banks of a river at a military encampment, some Delaware Indian chiefs came to him and they brought some of their youth that they wanted trained in America's schools. Now, Washington received those youth and he first guaranteed the chiefs, he said, Congress will look on these as if they're their own children. Congress would look after the Indian youth just the same as they would after the American youth. And then, in a speech on May the 12th, 1779, George Washington addressed the Delaware chiefs, and he commended them for their choice to bring their children to American schools. He told them this. He said, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and our way of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention." Now, what did Washington say that they would learn in American schools? Above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. And Congress would treat them the same as they treated their own children. You see, this was typical in American schools that we taught Christian principles above all. Thomas Jefferson is another one who had great impact in helping Christian principles remain in education. Now, we hear today that Thomas Jefferson is the one who gave us separation of church and state. Well, if that's true, he didn't practice what he preached, or what they tell us today about Jefferson must not be what Jefferson preached. You see, while Jefferson was President of the United States, he was also President of the School Board for Washington, D.C. schools. Jefferson authored the plan of education for Washington, D.C. schools. And in that plan of education that he authored, he placed the Bible and Watts hymnal as the primary reading text in Washington, D.C. public schools. Now, the Bible we know. Watts hymnal? Why would a songbook be a reading book in schools? Because Watts' hymnal was filled with doctrine. It wasn't like singing songs or choruses. No, Watts' hymnal was full of doctrine. He had them just read the hymnal just to get Christian doctrine. And those were the two texts that Jefferson placed in schools. Now, why would Jefferson have put the Bible in schools? Well, he made his views very clear on that. He said, "I have always said and always will say that the studious perusal of the sacred volume will make us better citizens." Thomas Jefferson, in his actions as president, after the First Amendment had long been passed, put the Bible and Watts' hymnal as the primary reading text. Now, another president of the United States was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a great political leader, had a great distinguished career. He served 18 years in the House of Representatives. He was a U.S. Senator. He was President of the United States. He was Secretary of State. He was Foreign Ambassador to Russia and to England and to France. And he's the only founding father, or the first founding father, that lived long enough to have a photograph taken of him. Now, that photograph has since been colorized, but this is a picture of John Quincy Adams when he was 79 years old. Well, John Quincy talked about a textbook that he could still remember there in his latter years. He could still remember having learned lessons out of the New England Primer. The New England Primer had been his very first textbook, but that was not at all unusual. The New England Primer was the first textbook ever printed in America. It was printed in Boston in 1690, and from 1690 until 1900, if you went to schools in America, you probably learned to read out of the New England Primer. That was the primary textbook. We had presidents all the way through James A. Garfield that talked about the lessons that they learned out of the New England Primer. Now, the New England Primer went through several different reprints. You had reprints that came out in a number of years. For example, here's a 1777 reprint, and you can see the hero there was John Hancock. And then when the 1795 reprint came out, the hero at that time was George Washington. And then when the 1820 New England Primer came out, you see in the front of it is a picture of the little children coming unto Jesus. And it really didn't matter which primer it was, the outside was different, but the insides always remained the same. There were three things that were common to every single New England primer, and that was the rhyming alphabet, the alphabet of lessons for youth, and the shorter catechism. Now, look at what was composed in these three areas, and this was the same in all primers for 210 years. Look at the rhyming alphabet. You'll see the ABCs going down the page there, and out beside is a little rhyme. You see, A, in Adam's fall we sinned all. B, heaven to find, the Bible mind. C, Christ crucified for sinners died. Or look at G, as runs the glass our life does pass. H, my book and heart must never part. Notice the picture there, a Bible hidden inside the heart, very much like Psalms 119, thy word have I hidden in my heart that I might not sin against thee. Well, they also had the alphabet of lessons for youth, and that was the ABCs down a page, and out beside each letter of the alphabet was a phrase that the students memorized. All of the phrases were Bible verses. Look at what we memorized in our textbooks for over 210 years. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. D, do not the abominable thing which I hate, saith the Lord. E, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And the third section that was common to every New England primer was a shorter catechism. Now, recall, this is the equivalent of a first grade textbook. They didn't have grade levels then, but this was the beginning reader. This is where students started. It's what we would call a first grade textbook. And notice these for some of the first grade questions. Which is the fifth commandment? What is required in the fifth commandment? What is forbidden in the fifth commandment? What is the reason annexed to the fifth commandment? Or try some of these for first grade questions. What offices does Christ execute as our Redeemer? How does Christ execute the office of a prophet? How does Christ execute the office of a priest? How does Christ execute the office of a king? Or even this question, what are the benefits which in this life do accompany or flow from justification, adoption, and sanctification? Now that was the textbook, the beginning textbook of schools for 210 years in America. Quite a remarkable system of education that we had. Well, another one of the significant influences on American education was Daniel Webster. Now, Daniel Webster was born during the American Revolution, but he grew up listening to the speeches of people like George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Webster was 17 years old when Washington died. He was 44 when Adams and Jefferson departed this life, and he outlived the elderly James Madison by only 16 years. Now, Daniel Webster became a permanent fixture in the United States Senate, and his long tenure in the Senate was interrupted only to serve as Secretary of State under 3 different presidents. Webster was also a tremendous lawyer. He personally argued and won numerous cases before the United States Supreme Court, and many was the time when an opposing lawyer, on hearing that Webster would be his opponent, withdrew from the case rather than suffer defeat before Webster's genius. And one of the cases that Webster argued in front of the Supreme Court dealt with a school in Philadelphia that had decided that it was going to teach its students morality without the aid of religion. The school had been started by a man who had moved to America from France. That man had been a student of the French Enlightenment, Stephen Girard, and he determined that you could have morality without religion, so he left $7 million to the city of Philadelphia to establish this college, this school. And part of the requirement was no ministers allowed on this campus whatsoever. We will teach morality, but we'll have no Christian ministers on campus. Well, when that case made the Supreme Court, what might have been from any other attorney's lips nothing more than a dry legal argument, from Webster's lips became an emotional appeal on the importance of instructing students in school from the teachings of Christ. That argument in front of the Supreme Court lasted for 3 days. Now, Webster took in his own records, and he recorded all of his notes before he died. This set of Webster's writings is the only version that was personally edited by Daniel Webster before he died. And in here, he gives the transcript of what happened at the Supreme Court case. Listen to some of Webster's statements, some of his arguments before the Supreme Court on the importance of teaching students about Jesus Christ. He said, when little children were brought into the presence of the Son of God, his disciples proposed to send them away. But Jesus said, suffer the little children to come unto me. Unto me. He did not send them first for lessons in morals to the schools of the Pharisees or to the unbelieving Sadducees, nor to read the precepts and lessons phylacteries on the garments of the Jewish priesthood. He said nothing of different creeds or clashing doctrines, but he opened at once to the youthful mind the everlasting fountain of living waters, the only source of eternal truth. Suffer little children to come unto me. and that injunction is of perpetual obligation. It addresses itself today with the same earnestness and the same authority which attended its first utterance to the Christian world. It is of force everywhere and at all times. It extends to the end of the earth. It will reach to the end of time, always and everywhere, sounding in the ears of men with an emphasis which nothing can supersede. Suffer the little children to come unto me. Webster's point was well founded. When Jesus wanted to teach students morality, he didn't send them away. He said, no, let them come to me. Now, after Webster's argument before the court for those 3 days, how did the court rule? Well, interestingly, the court ruled, no, we will not have a school in America that will not teach Christian principles. Here's the specific statement of the court. It says, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? No, there was no way that we were going to have education in America that did not include Christian principles, because that would violate everything the founders had stood for. It would violate every law that we'd had on education for all those years. Christianity would have remained the base. The Supreme Court held out long after the Founding Fathers. Now, the Founding Fathers had really structured education very much the way that Martin Luther had recommended. Notice a statement that Martin Luther said about schools, and this is exactly what the founders believed. They said, I am very much afraid that schools will prove to be the great gates of hell unless they diligently labor in explaining the Holy Scriptures, engraving them in the hearts of youth. He said, I advise no one to place his child where the Scriptures do not reign paramount. Every institution in which men are not increasingly occupied with the Word of God must become corrupt. And that accurately identified America's educational system. In the Department of Education, there is an area where they have collected all the old textbooks they could find that were used in America's schools from 1775 through 1900. And that is just a library section of old textbooks. And the challenge is to go into that section and find an area of curricular study that is not based on the Bible and Christian principle. Virtually any textbook you pick up, any area of study, you open it, you'll find, even in some of the math books, Christian principles and biblical principles right there in the textbooks. That's the way it had always been in America. Now, the effect of this education was very apparent. For example, you consider someone like Fisher Ames. Now, Fisher Ames, we talked about, he's the man who gave us the wording for the First Amendment. Fisher Ames was also the founding father who suggested 2-year terms for congressmen. Prior to that time, there had always been annual elections every year, but Fisher Ames suggested 2-year terms. Well, Fisher Ames entered Harvard when he was 12 years old, but that was not unusual. You look down through the records of Harvard and Yale, and it was not unusual for a student to enter when he was a single digit in number. Or you take someone like John Trumbull. Now, John Trumbull grew up learning law from John Adams. He was a protege to John Adams. On top of that, he was very active in politics in Connecticut. He was on the Supreme Court of Connecticut. He was an ardent patriot during the Revolution. He even helped Noah Webster with the dictionary. John Trumbull, when he was 4 years old, had already read through the Bible for the first time. At the age of 6, he won a Greek contest against his local minister, and when he was 7.5 years old, he passed the entrance exam to Yale. Now, his parents decided to hold him out of school until he was 13, but he passed the entrance exam for Yale at the age of 7.5. Or even John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, when he was 14 years old, under this system of education, received a U.S. congressional diplomatic appointment overseas to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. Such an act would be unthinkable today, but that was typical of the educational system that our founding fathers had. Consider these elementary spelling words. You remember Webster's Blueback Speller? This is an elementary spelling book. Notice the elementary spelling words that we had. Contumelious, ichthyology, bronchotomy, eschatology, loquacious, rapacious, sagacious, and other words in this elementary book that probably most of us have never even seen before. And that was elementary spelling in America for 150 years. Our founding fathers had an extremely successful system of education, and that educational system built on Christian principles had great impact on the government that they formed. It was Abraham Lincoln, nearly 100 years later, who made this observation. He said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. And so it was with America's government. Now today, we have really lost our founding fathers. We had nearly 250 founding fathers. We had 56 who signed the Declaration. We had 55 at the convention which framed the Constitution. We had 90 in the first Congress which gave us the Bill of Rights, and many other significant founders. But today we do real well if we think we can remember a dozen of those founding fathers. Well, that was not always the case in previous times. This book, called The Lives of the Signers, was a school textbook that dealt with nothing but the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. And this textbook goes through and it gives 4 to 8 to 12 pages of biographical information on every one of those men. It tells them what they sacrificed for the cause of liberty. They pledged their life, their fortune, their sacred honor. But today, the Founding Fathers have disappeared out of our textbooks. There was a study done by the Department of Education that took the top 60 history textbooks in the United States and examined them to see how we were teaching history to our students. And they said those 60 textbooks were used by 88% of the nation's students. What they found in that survey was stunning. This is the complete study by the Department of Education, and they specifically looked in one study at 3rd and 6th grade readers dealing with history. And in those 3rd and 6th grade readers, they found some 670 stories that dealt with America's history that students in 3rd and 6th grade read. What was remarkable was only 5 of them dealt with the founding era. 3 of them dealt with someone named Sybil Ludington, who in 1777 hopped on horseback and rode to neighboring villages to tell them the British were coming. One dealt with a young girl who wanted to serve in Washington's army. She was not allowed to do so, and she ended up carrying food to him at Valley Forge. And one story dealt with a young boy who had caught a British soldier stealing vegetables out of his garden. He single-handedly caught him. Those were the only 5 stories in our students' readers on American founding. There was not a single story on Patrick Henry, Daniel Boone, Nathan Hale, Paul Revere. Not a single story. They had completely disappeared. And the problem is that when we lose our founders, we lose their teachings. And when we lose their teachings, we lose their ideas. Now, how significant is it that we lose their ideas? Well, there was a conversation that went on between an American statesman and a French historian some 80 years after the Declaration of Independence. And at this point in time, America was still very successful in its first form of government. But France, in that same period of time, had already been through several forms of government. And so the French historian Francois Guizot looked at the American statesman James Russell Lowell, and he said, just how long is the American Republic going to endure? And James Russell Lowell replied to him. He said, as long as the ideas of the men who founded it continue dominant. Well, the problem we have today is we don't know their ideas, and if we don't know their ideas, we can't protect their ideas. Psalms 11:3 says, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? You see, we can't protect our foundations if we don't know what our foundations are. We have to become active in going back and relearning about the Founding Fathers, relearning about their teachings, and relearning about their ideas so that we can protect the foundations on which this nation was birthed. And there is no doubt whatsoever that this nation was birthed on Christian principles. All the way through textbooks, all the way through the writings of the Founding Fathers, it was very, very clear that this nation was built firmly on Christian principles, both in government and in education. And our responsibility is to go back and relearn about the writings of the Founding Fathers. They were prolific writers. Most of them wrote anywhere from 5 to 25 books. Many of them are still available today in libraries. Let's go back and rediscover our Founding Fathers, rediscover their teachings, and rediscover our American roots.
This video has given you a glimpse of what's available to you from WallBuilders. David Barton is reaching a lost generation today through the powerful videos and books he has produced with thorough, painstaking research to show clearly how far America has fallen in the last 30 years. America's Godly Heritage is his premier video. It gives you the evidence detailing how the Supreme Court has robbed an entire generation of the philosophies and education the Founding Fathers intended us to have. You'll see what's happened to a generation in terms of the divorce rate, crime, teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and a host of other plagues that have befallen America since the court decisions of the 60s. Most importantly, you'll hear again and again the words and life stories of Founding Fathers who never intended the separation of church and state the court has given us. With the great paintings and scores of documents that recreate an era long past, this video will help you understand why this nation needs to return to its godly heritage. The exciting new title is actually a classic that David Barton has brought back into print, the New England Primer. For almost 2 centuries, this was the textbook for beginning students. This valuable reprint of the 1777 edition serves as an excellent resource for demonstrating what education used to be. Plus, it serves as an exceptional teaching text for those who want to raise their children and grandchildren on the same course of study that educated the Founding Fathers. In the newly expanded version of the book, America, To Pray or Not to Pray, and in the intriguing The Myth of Separation, David Barton tells in full detail how America has been sold a false doctrine and made to suffer for it. That doctrine is the popularly held concept of separation of church and state. David Barton clearly shows us that this myth is not constitutional and has caused undue grief to a generation. And the bulletproof George Washington tells the true, unforgettable story of God's intervention in George Washington's escape from death. These and many other materials are available to you through WallBuilders, Post Office Box 397, Aledo, Texas 76008. Or you may call 817-441-6044 for more information. David Barton is speaking around the country to thousands who want to know what has happened to our godly heritage. If you'd like him to make a presentation to your church or civic group, write or call today.